So we have all of Jefferson's private letters, all of his day books, all of the accounts of Monticello, all of the accounts of his property on Boylston Street in Boston have more Jefferson papers than exist in the entire state of Virginia. So.
Hi, and welcome to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. I'm Sam, your host, and before we get any further on Unplanned, let me remind you to subscribe. We're going to have lots more interesting conversations to come. But today on Unplanned, we're going to get into one of the hottest and most important topics of the day. That's the question of what do we do with our monuments? The issue of Confederate monuments has come up over and over again with regard to Black Lives Matter and all the issues of the changes in America, and how do we record our history in our public spaces. Today on the show, we've got a wonderful guest, Gavin Kleespies, who works at the Massachusetts Historical Society and is the former executive director of the Cambridge Historical Society. Gavin has done a lot of work thinking about this and what do we do with all the things from our past and how do we remember them? How do we record them? And what should we do with them? Gavin, I want to welcome you to Unplanned.
Thanks, Sam. Nice to see you.
Well, it's good to see you. And it's great to have one of these conversations. We've had lots of opportunity to talk about some of the issues around history in Cambridge, specifically where you know it intimately, and you worked here for many years before moving over to Boston, working in Boston. I want to get your take just on the overall topic of monuments. It's obviously in the news, and when we talked about doing this show, you said it's rapidly evolving. What do you mean by that? What does that mean?
Well, I think just the national discussion about monuments are rapidly evolving, and I think the way people are understanding monuments is changing dramatically. I mean, and I think that part of that is also probably a segment of the population, the white population, sort of catching up with the rest of the country in taking a little bit more of a critical look at monuments and thinking about them a little bit more deeply. I think for many people, it's easy to just walk past monuments and really they blend into the background and you don't really notice them that much. And that may be true for people who are very much in a position of power. I think it's good for people in that position of power to take a step back and say, well, what if I wasn't in this position of power and I spent every day walking past, many, 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 many monuments to people that didn't look anything like me and never seen an image of a person who looked like me. And what would that say to me? And what does that say about how we're presenting our city and how welcoming we are? So I think that
you mentioned a very interesting word in there, which is of course power. And the choice of what gets remembered and particularly how it gets remembered is in some ways an expression of power or who gets to write the book, maybe. What can you add to that topic? Because that is, of course, a fascinating part of all of this, and it's probably underlies a lot of the conversation that we're having publicly now.
Well, I mean, the monuments come in many, many, many different forms, and there's lots of different ways that they're developed. But in some cases, it's simply that a family has enough money and they commission a statue and they plonk it down somewhere and it becomes a public monument. So it's in that case, it's absolutely about just a family having enough money and enough political connections to have it placed in a public space. It's not like a vetted process. It's not necessarily one where there's community engagement or people are going through this whole, development. And in other cases, it is very community involved. And I think as the city has evolved, all cities have evolved. There's now much more of a planned thinking about how monuments are erected. But many of the existing ones that are there because a family had enough money to commission it and they had the political resources to get it placed on a public spot. And it's been there forever since. And there really wasn't any evaluation or any thought about what it meant to other people.
Let's spend a second on what you do now in your day work. You're currently the Massachusetts Historical Society. Before that, you were the Cambridge Historical Society. What role did these societies, these organizations play in some of these discussions around, say, the memorializing of people or of places and the choice of how all that works? What experiences have you had in terms of thinking about this?
So honestly, both the Cambridge Historical Society and the Massachusetts Historical Society are independent nonprofit organizations. Neither of them are part of the government, either municipal or statewide. And they don't currently regulate monuments in any meaningful way. Both of them own a single building and are based in that building. So it's not, they're maybe not the best example. In other states, there are historical societies which are also in charge of preservation and have landmarking status, and are much more involved in that kind of a discussion. But in Massachusetts, that's really divided, and the Massachusetts Historical Commission will be the people who are actually involved in discussions of statewide monuments, and then more relevantly, in the cities, the Cambridge Historical Commission in Cambridge, probably in partnership with the Cambridge Arts Council, would be the people who are working on and reviewing monuments in the city. I think that the Historical Commission would be in charge of the care and maintenance, not care and maintenance, but making sure that they're well cared for and they're not damaged. So practically speaking, I have little or no authority over.
Right. I want to delve into the issue of Confederate monuments in a slightly sideways direction, which is that most, not all by any means, but most, the vast majority of those are in the South. They're south of the Mason-Dixon line, and they impact states that were part of the historic Confederacy. And there is a long history of the monuments themselves when they came into being, interestingly, decades after the end of the Civil War, and for another purpose, namely the establishment of Jim Crow in many cases, at least it's argued. And I don't doubt that argument at all. The North has a different history, and certainly in New England, we have a very different history, including the earliest of the English settlements here, and the many, many markers to the very first arrivals from Europe, and then to the colonial history. What are some of the things you might point out or call out about historical markers in the Boston metro area? As you say, a lot of times we just walk past these and we don't think twice about them, but they have a whole meaning and they help us define who we are. What are some of the things you would note about our local history and our local monuments?
Well, I mean, I think that, how to say this? I honestly think that monuments are a pretty bad way to convey anything about history. I don't think they really tell us all that much. They're very static. And this is not all monuments. I think that there are impressive conceptions of monuments. I think that there are things that people can create that make people think about a situation, that make people think about ideas, that provoke conversation. I think that those are good monuments. I think statues of individuals or statues of, a person on a horseback rarely conveys much. I mean, I don't think you really learn a lot from looking at that. I don't think it really sparks much of a conversation. I don't think it's really doing a very good job of telling people their history. I think that some of the monuments, I'm most familiar with Cambridge, but some of the monuments have great stories behind them. They're good anecdotes that you can tell if you happen to know them. But I don't know that they tend to really evoke much from people.
Let me jump into your train of thought here. If they don't tell you much, what do they do? I mean, they are imposing. They can be quite imposing. Let's note to start with, they almost all represent men. They all are well above our heads and typically are either looking out on the horizon or looking down on us. do you think monuments do in the public square? We're talking about things that happen in the public square.
So just thinking about monuments in Cambridge that I can think of. So, um, and I certainly don't know off the top of my head all of the monuments that exist in Cambridge, but just the ones that I can think of. Um, the vast majority of them do represent men, not exclusively. The Irish Potato Famine Monument on the Cambridge Common has a woman and a child. Almost all of them represent white people. The Prince Hall Monument, also on the Common, would be an exception to that. I don't doubt that there are other exceptions that I'm not thinking of right now, but just sort of scrolling through, walking through Harvard Square, there's a lot of monuments to white people, white men. I mean, certainly John Harvard, certainly the Civil War Monument on the Cambridge Common, John Bridges also on the Cambridge Common. There's a World War I soldier at the meeting of, what is it, Garden and Concord?
Spanish-American War. I think I'm thinking of the same
Is it
one.
Spanish?
I think.
Oh, okay. I thought it was a World War I. But there's a lot of monuments to men. There's a lot of heroization of military. And I think that it enforces essentially like a hegemonic power of, white male power. I think that it's just sort of saying, like, look at the people in bronze. Those are the people who are powerful, and it's not sort of inviting much of a dialogue. And I think for many people, you just walk past it and it just doesn't register. It doesn't spark much of a thought. But in the back of your mind, it's like when you think of a statue, you think of a white man standing there, very often, with a military accoutrements.
So what do you think, given that you're somebody who does work with history, historical artifacts, historical things from the past, what are ways that we might want to think about moving forward? One of the really interesting things about the Black Lives Matter movement is that it is really forcing us to rethink or readdress a lot of the issues around the question of what we record and how we tell the stories. How are you approaching this as you confront some of these issues in your work?
Well, I think that we need to have discussions. We need to have, I think we need to engage community members in thinking about this. I think that the idea that something has been someplace for a long time shouldn't be the end of the discussion. It shouldn't just be, we're doing it this way because we've always done it this way. I think that there should be discussion about whether we want to remove some monuments or not. I think that, but I think it should be a community discussion, and I think that there should be a lot of people thinking about this and talking about this. I think that it's important in every context to actually understand the history of the monuments, when they went up, why they went up, who put them up, who paid for them, what the intentions were behind that. I think having that in the discussion is important. But I also think at the end of the day, if a monument exists in the community and that community doesn't want that, it doesn't matter if it was installed with the best of intentions. It's what the community wants that frankly matters. Like, we should not impose images and likenesses on a community that doesn't want that there. So we should find out what the community wants and if they want these monuments there or they don't want them there. And we should figure out how to move forward based on that. And then I think,
Let me jump in. What should we do with the monuments if they're removed? I mean, in some ways they do represent, they both have their own personal history around the monument, but they also represent a person or a point in time in history as well. How should we think about that?
I think that we should have a discussion about it. And I mean, that's kind of a boring answer. But I think that, there's more than one way to think about it. There certainly are suggestions of sort of like graveyards for old statues, where lots of old statues are put together in a place and people can visit it if they want to, or they don't have to visit it. That certainly has happened in places like Eastern Europe. I don't know that that's the right solution. Cambridge is a space that's very short on free space. So I don't know if that's what we want to do. There's certainly, people have argued for just selling them and taking the assets and using that money for creating something new, creating new art. That's an option. There may be museums that would be willing to house them. There may not be museums that would be willing to house them. I mean, whatever these objects are, we need to admit that them being there has a cost, because they're occupying a space that something else can't occupy. So even just that is a cost, and they have to be maintained, or they end up looking very bad. There are costs to having these things here, and if we're keeping them in the community, it's because we're willing to spend the money to keep them in the community. And if the community doesn't want them, we should figure out what to do. If they do want them, we should acknowledge that we want them and we're going to invest the money to maintain them.
It's interesting. I would add to that, and I think it's part of the national discussion that we're having, is that there is a cost, if you will. I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily a negative, but there is a cost to it. But it's also, I think, particularly in the light of Confederate monuments, there's a psychic cost, obviously, and then there's a sort of a physical cost. There's only so much space. There's only so much land. You can only dedicate so much land to memorializing anything. And so it's an opportunity cost. If we choose to talk about this, we don't choose to talk about that. And it's interesting to sort of be confronted with that, because I think so often they are these sort of passive things that we just walk past, we just walk by. I want to switch gears slightly and focus in on Cambridge. You know Cambridge very, very well. I want to ask you what are some of your favorite monuments? Because I'd like to share some of those with the audience. Tell us one or two or three or however many that you particularly like, and maybe I'll throw in some video footage of them while you're talking about them.
So I have a personal fascination with monuments that have quirky stories associated with them. So I think it's no shock, but one of my favorite things is the marker for Leif Erikson's house, which is—
And what is the story behind that, and where is it? Because I'll need to go find it.
So it is essentially where Memorial Drive turns and becomes Fresh Pond Parkway. It is on the side of the street where Mount Auburn Hospital is, and it's very small. It's probably 2 feet by 18 inches, something like that. It's a small granite plaque that's set on the ground. And again, this is something that many, many, many people walk past and never even notice that there's a plaque there, let alone look at it. But it says on this spot in the year 1000 AD, Leif Erikson built his house in Vineland. And all of that is crazy. It's all wrong. And it's just, so there is—
so what's the story behind the monument then? That begs that question. Why did that end up there?
It ended up there where it is now because in the 1970s, the state widened Memorial Drive and extended it. It was originally about 1,000 feet away from where it stands now. So not only is it historically inaccurate, it's in the wrong place. But it was placed by a man named Eben Norton Horsford, or through the efforts of a man named Eben Norton Horsford, who was actually quite famous. He was a chemist who was a professor at Harvard for a while. He was the Rumsford professor at Harvard. He focused on food chemistry. And among other things, invented baking powder. So if you've ever gone to the store and you've seen Rumsford baking powder, which is a very popular brand.
Interesting.
That's his brand. So it's named after his position at Harvard, his professorship. But he, after having really quite a prominent, successful life, late in his life became obsessed with the idea that Vikings had discovered America before Christopher Columbus, and dedicated the end of his life to proving this. He's responsible for numerous Viking monuments and Viking images that exist in the area. And this is one of these examples of things that people walk past all the time and don't notice, but there's a lot of it there. So
But let's just be absolutely clear. Leif Erikson did not live in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1000 AD. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so there is archaeological evidence that suggests that Vikings did make it to North America, but they made it to the northern tip of Canada. They were not they were 1,000 miles north of here. There's no evidence to suggest that they came anywhere close to this far south. So Eben Norton Horsford, and for the record, the archaeological evidence that's been discovered was discovered in the latter half of the 20th century. At the time that Eben Norton Horsford was doing this, there was no evidence to support this. There was,
but in his mind, it was archaeologically correct, at least.
yes, and there were. I can talk about this for a very long time, so we'll probably try to curtail how far I get into this, but
I want to ask you about another Cambridge thing. Unless you, so let me jump to that. But unless you've got another burning monument you want to talk about.
Well,
but
one thing that I would say about the Vikings is that the number of Viking monuments that exist is really sort of breathtaking. Like there's a tower in Weston that's called Norumbega Tower. There is a statue of Leif Erikson on Commonwealth Ave in Boston. There are the base of the Longfellow Bridge, the Salt and Pepper Bridge. If you look at it, the base has the prows of Viking ships depicted on it. The Weld Boathouse at Harvard has the prow of a Viking ship above its front door. There's a Viking ship at one of the entrances into MIT's buildings. There's just like a remarkable number of images of Viking vessels and Viking iconography.
What's the reason for that? I mean, it sounds as though there was a Viking fascination, and maybe there still is. I don't know, but
so I think that I think that it's really interesting. I think that this sort of goes to the current discussion. So it's sort of funny when you think about it, like, haha, they thought Leif Erikson lived here. But all of this came up around the end of the 19th century. And if you do a search for Vikings in the online Cambridge Chronicle, you'll see that there are a number of times where references to Vikings spike. And they tend to be around periods where there's anxiety about immigration or foreign engagement in the US. And at the end of the 19th century, the US and Cambridge and Boston is seeing a large influx of Southern European immigrants coming from Italy and Portugal and other southern countries. And there was a lot of anxiety about how the community was changing. Within someone like Eben Norton Horsford, there was a real desire to link America's past to a Northern European identity. And he was a neighbor of and was certainly in social circles with people like Ole Bull, who was Norwegian, and Ole Bull's wife, Sarah Bull, who was very prominent socially. And I think that they really wanted to link America's past to a Northern European identity and to reject that the country had been discovered by an Italian sailing under a Spanish flag.
What are you doing in your day job? You spend all your days thinking about how to work with history and how to bring it to life for present day. I don't know if you can share some of the work you're doing now or some of the work you've done in the past. It's fascinating, and I'm always curious as to what you're up to. What are you working on these days, or what have you worked on that we might be interested to hear about?
Sure. So I work at the Massachusetts Historical Society now. I essentially manage programs, public programs, exhibitions, and community partnerships. So with exhibitions, I mean, during COVID-19, there's somewhat limited visitorship. So our building is closed to the public, and it has been since the middle of March. So we are shifting gears right now, and we're actually trying to launch our first online only exhibition. So our first ever online only exhibition will be which originally was planned to be a physical exhibition. So we're sort of shifting gears midstream. But the online exhibition is going to be looking at how political cartoons have looked at issues related to citizenship in the past and the right to vote. Sort of a little bit of a history of political cartoons and a little bit of looking at how cartoons have talked about voting rights and access to voting. So this is sort of starting with Thomas Nast, who is considered by many to be the first political cartoonist. He published extensively with Harper's. And within our collection, we have a lot of examples of his work in our collection of Harper's, and then going all the way through to present day artists. So,
and when will this go live? Is this live now, or is when
it'll go live in the beginning of September.
All right, so I hopefully you'll share that with us when it's live, and we can hopefully put it out on Unplanned just to let people know about it. Gavin, I want to just thank you again for joining us on Unplanned. We could talk for hours. I find your work endlessly fascinating. I find your ability to explain and describe history endlessly fascinating. And I really hope we can get you back on the show sometime soon.
Okay. Thanks for having me.